Welcome to today's explainer. We are jumping right into Lesson 8, breaking down the absolute bedrock of educational evaluation, the distinction between formative and summative assessment. Whether you're an educator building out a syllabus or a learner just trying to make sense of how you're being graded, understanding how we use continuous feedback to adjust learning versus how we use final tests for grading is a total game changer.
So let's kick things off with a question pretty much every educator has to grapple with. What actually separates the everyday classroom testing from those massive, high-stress final exams at the end of the year? I mean, we intuitively know that a casual Friday pop quiz feels wildly different from a 3-hour final, right? But academically speaking, how are these tools actually functioning differently in the learning process?
To figure that out, we're going to follow the life cycle of a course right through these 6 areas: the role of assessment, formative and summative types, the 5 purposes of testing, scoring strategies, and finally, the washback effect.
Let's start with Section 1, the role of assessment.
Before we can even start categorizing tests, we really need to nail down what assessment actually means in an academic setting. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that assessment is not just a test. It's an everyday classroom practice where teachers are constantly making judgments about student progress and communicating those findings. We kind of fall into this trap of thinking assessment only happens when it's totally quiet, students have a pen in hand, and there's a printed exam on the desk. But in reality, assessment is happening all the time. Every single time a teacher asks a question to the room and reads the crowd, that's assessment. It serves this great dual purpose. It tests what students know, sure, but it also teaches them exactly where they need to improve.
Educational literature, specifically looking at texts like Unit A12, formally splits this whole concept into 2 branches. It draws a very deliberate line in the sand between the assessments that happen while the learning is still ongoing and the ones that happen once the learning has completely wrapped up.
Which brings us to Section 2, formative assessment, or as we like to call it, fine-tuning.
So this is the testing that happens in the messy, active middle of a course. It's framed as this continuous loop that lets the teacher advise students, monitor their learning, and literally fine-tune the instruction on the fly. You can think of formative assessment as a real-time diagnostic tool. It's your rough drafts, the quick quizzes, peer reviews, the back-and-forth classroom discussions. The main goal here isn't to slap a permanent grade on someone, it's to generate feedback. If a teacher gives a formative assessment and suddenly realizes, wow, the entire class completely missed the core concept, they can immediately pivot and adjust their lesson plan for the next day. It is highly responsive.
Now let's shift gears to Section 3, summative assessment, which is all about summing up.
Because as a course nears its end, the time for practicing and fine-tuning simply runs out. Unlike that everyday monitoring we just talked about, summative assessment is your final summation of achievement. This is the high-stakes environment, folks. We're talking final exams, standardized tests, massive term papers. At this stage, the window for the teacher to intervene and change a student's trajectory for that specific course, it's closed. The goal is no longer to advise. It's strictly to evaluate and measure the total accumulated knowledge against the course objective.
To put them head-to-head, as a teacher, your formative assessments are your steering wheel to adjust course, while your summative assessments are the checkered flag. Think about it like driving a car. You make 1,000 tiny formative adjustments to the steering wheel just to stay on the road, right? That feedback is immediate and, well, necessary for survival. But the summative assessment, that's just the moment you cross the finish line. It records your final time. It doesn't help you drive better in that specific race anymore, but it gives you a definitive measure of how well you performed overall. Both are absolutely critical, but they're doing entirely different jobs.
Let's move on to Section 4, the 5 purposes of assessment.
Assessment isn't just this simple binary choice between formative and summative. It's a highly targeted tool. The source text outlines 5 main reasons we evaluate learners. First up, diagnostic. These are usually formative, happening right at the beginning of a course to see where we might need some remedial action. Then you have achievement assessments, which simply let learners show what they've mastered so far. Performance assessments are highly practical, like can the student actually write the essay or conduct the experiment. Proficiency assessments are your classic summative certification exams, checking general competence. And finally, accountability. This is the administrative side, where schools literally have to prove to funding authorities that they're actually hitting their intended educational outcomes.
But here's the catch. Regardless of which of those 5 purposes you're aiming for, every single assessment must pass 2 critical tests of its own: validity and reliability. You could design the best course in the universe, but if your assessments fail on these 2 fronts, your data is completely useless.
So what do those mean?
Well, a valid test accurately hits the target construct, while a reliable test hits that exact same target consistently, no matter who is doing the grading. Think of it like a dartboard. If your goal is to test a student's ability to write an argumentative essay, but your test just asks them to list some historical facts, that test lacks validity. You're hitting the wrong dartboard entirely. Now, imagine a test that is beautifully designed, perfectly valid, but when 3 different teachers grade the exact same essay, one gives it an A, one gives it a C, and one gives it an F, that test lacks reliability. To actually work, an assessment has to be valid in its design and reliable in its grading.
And that naturally brings us to Section 5, Scoring and Feedback Strategies.
Once you've got that valid, reliable test, you have to decide how you're actually going to score it. This brings us to criterion reference strategies. First is holistic scoring. It's easy, but it lacks diagnostic feedback. A teacher reads an essay, gives it an 85 out of 100 based on their overall impression, and moves on. It's fast, but as a student, you have no idea why you got an 85. Analytic scoring solves that. The teacher breaks it down. You got 90% for organization, but 70% for grammar. That provides incredible formative feedback, even though it takes way longer to grade. Then there's primary trait scoring, which hyper-focuses on just one specific skill. If the trait is identifying main points, the scorer completely ignores spelling and grammar and only grades that single cognitive skill.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the big shift in academic assessment away from norm reference grading, which is judging students against each other, towards these criterion reference practices based on what a student can do. Historically, a lot of tests were norm referenced. Your grade depended on everyone else in the room did, grading on a curve. Today, the academic standard heavily favors criterion reference scoring. We want to evaluate the quality of a student's work against the stated set of criteria. It's no longer a game of being the smartest person in the room, it's strictly about whether you can successfully demonstrate the required skills.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, the washback effect.
You see, assessments don't just passively measure learning, they actively change it. The way you choose to assess your students doesn't happen in a vacuum. It echoes right back into the classroom, directly impacting motivation and shaping how you teach moving forward. The literature calls this the washback effect. If students know a summative final exam is only going to be multiple-choice grammar questions, the washback effect guarantees that both the teacher and the students will spend all their time drilling grammar rules and totally ignore broader communication skills. Assessment drives behavior. Positive washback happens when an assessment is so well designed that the very act of preparing for it teaches the exact high-level skills the course intended.
So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this to chew on. Are your tests simply summing up the past, or are they actively fine-tuning the future? Whether you're relying on quick formative checks or massive summative exams, just remember that every single assessment carries the power of washback. By carefully aligning your validity, reliability, and scoring criteria, you can ensure your evaluations do far more than just measure a student's ability. They actively elevate it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I hope this helps bring some incredible clarity to your own learning and teaching spaces.